Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. A few weeks ago, Macias-Rojas sent me a poem by Alvaro Rios about the border. Let me read you some excerpts from it. It's called The Border, a double sonnet. The border is a line that birds cannot see. The border says stop to the wind, but the wind speaks another language and keeps going. The border used to be an actual place, but now it is the act of 1,000 imaginations. The border, the word border, sounds like order, but in this place they do not rhyme. In my mind, this poem speaks powerfully not just to the futility of the border, but also its new ambiguity. The border used to be an actual place, a crossing. Now the border is an investigation into who we are, what we think, what our devices say we think. And the machinery of that surveillance isn't limited to border checkpoints. And obviously, these investigations are old, as we saw from today's panel. But they have first panel about the Chinese exclusion, but obviously they have expanded since then. The machinery of surveillance comes to define and pervade every community it touches, even places up to 100 miles away. I'm thrilled to moderate this panel on how border surveillance has been changing and what it looks like today. We'll begin with Hassan Shibly. And as folks are mic'd, if they want to come and join us on stage, we'll begin with Hassan Shibly of the Council on American Islamic Relations of Florida, who will talk about border searches and interrogations before and after the Muslim ban. He will speak from personal and legal experience. Then we will turn to Professor Patrisia Macias-Rojas of the University of Illinois at Chicago, who conducted an ethnography of life in actual border communities, places where sometimes the ratio of Border Patrol agents to residents is 1 to 17. Think about that for a moment. That is lower than the student-to-teacher ratio in many states. Finally, we will turn to Patrick Eddington of the Cato Institute. As the poet Rio said, the border used to be an actual place. Now, under regulations issued in the 1950s, the Border Patrol can conduct border searches anywhere within 100 miles of the border. And so Patrick will discuss those checkpoints. We will begin with Hassan.
Good morning, everyone. It's a tremendous honor and privilege to speak before all of you today, and I want to thank Alvaro and the Georgetown Law for hosting this critical program, because problems at the border isn't something new for me. I remember last night when I was actually crossing the border from Canada, and they asked me, where are you going? I said, I'm actually going to Georgetown. Why? Well, I'm going to speak about how you guys treat us at the border. I never had such a smooth experience crossing the border as I did that day. And in fact, he admitted, he said, yeah, what's happening to you guys at the border is BS. That was literally his language. He said the Muslim ban was unnecessary. It doesn't help keep this country safe. Most of the time we're holding you guys for no real reason. And frankly, it's used for intelligence gathering. And that's the truth. And I can tell you, every single time I visit Canada, I feel welcome. Since I've been a child, every time I visit my country, America, I feel like a suspect, like a criminal. And frankly, I think it's quite a traumatizing experience. The problems with Muslims crossing the border into America, or let me say this, the problem of Americans crossing into America based on their religion did not start with Donald Trump. It's been happening for quite a long time. And what really changed my life was back in 2005, I was in my first year at UB Law School, at undergrad at that time, and coming back from a conference late at night, and we're getting to the border slowly, and as we get to the border, my mom, rolls down the window, it's snowing outside, it's cold, it's midnight, and they say, where were you? She said, we're at an Islamic conference in Toronto. She said, ma'am, we'd like you to go in for a random inspection. So my mom, who wears the headscarf and is professor of orthodontics at the University of New York at Buffalo, said, what do you mean random? I said, Mom, random means they saw your headscarf. But I didn't think that would be the actual case. And yet, when I woke up my little sister and my brother, carried them into secondary inspection, I was shocked. I literally felt like I was in my local mosque. There was over 40 members of the American Muslim community. We were held overnight till about 6 a.m., so 6 hours. We were fingerprinted, photographed, frisked, literally put on the wall, legs kicked open. My mom, as she was crying, taking her biometrics. Meanwhile, non-citizens were in and out in 15 minutes. And I told the officers, I said, sir, while you're wasting time with this elderly couple, these babies that are crying, us just because of our religion, real criminals could be getting by. And he said, sir, I'm afraid of the same exact thing. And sure enough, the next day I read in the New York Times that a man who killed an entire family in Canada made it across the border with the bloody weapons in his car. But he wasn't stopped because he looked more like Trump and less like me. That's the truth. Profiling doesn't work. It makes our country less safe, and it makes us less free. Because the conversation within the American Muslim community now is, should we be hiding our identity so we don't get picked on by US Customs? And unfortunately, the data supports the fact that, and it's probably through disparate impact. I don't think there's a sheet that says if you're Muslim, stop them. That would be clearly unconstitutional. But there's a lot of facially neutral criteria which pretty much results in a highly disproportionate number of American Muslims being singled out at the border. What I've actually done is spot check. So I will go into secondary inspection and I will count out how many people are visibly Muslim in the room. I've often documented cases where it's 50 to 75% of the people who are stopped are members of the American Muslim community. At the same time, when I go into a gathering with majority Muslim population, I ask them, how many of you have been stopped by US Customs and held for random inspections? About 50% raise their hand. I say, how many of you filed complaints? About 1%. People are scared because you know what happens when you file complaints? We've documented a number of times where when people file complaints, the next thing that happens is FBI show up at their home or at their office and start interrogating them. And maybe start pushing them to become informants. The Intercept has done excellent work exposing how the data gathered by US Customs is then used by the FBI for intel gathering and then informant recruitment. And they're not just informants, they're actually being pushed into agent provocateur and entrapment operations, which is a whole separate topic that hopefully we can discuss in a future convening. And this continues to hit home. In the month leading up to Trump's inauguration, I actually remember I was going skiing with my brother. And we were supposed to meet at noon, and it's 2 o'clock, he doesn't show up. So I call him, I'm like, Akram, where are you? He said, I was held at the border for the last 2 hours. They demanded my cell phone. They made me turn over my password. They downloaded all the data off of it. I said, Akram, you're under no legal obligation, and this is a point for all of you, you're under no legal obligation to provide your password or unlock your phone. Yes, they may take the phone away, but they can do that even if you unlock it. Now, 3 days later, my brother was again traveling across the border. This time, turn over your cell phone. No. Immediately, within a second, they choked him, slammed him to the ground, forcibly removed the cell phone off of him, using arguably lethal force to search electronics without suspicion, without a warrant. Mind you, that in the Riley case, domestically, the police, even if they arrest you, cannot search your phone without a warrant in most circumstances. So why is it different at the border? And this is where those who are in Congress, those who work for members of Congress, we really need to push for change in the legislation, while at the same time we are working for change through the courts. Now, the interesting thing is that the Buffalo News did a story to see what happened, to tell the story of my brother. And they interviewed one of the border agents, and what one of the border agents said was, well, think about it. If you have a car of 2 teenagers, a car of 2 grandmas, and a car of 2 Muslim men, who do you pull over for secondary inspection? Let me rephrase that. If you have a car of 2 teenagers, 2 grandmas, and 2 Jewish men, who do you pull over? 2 African American men, who do you pull over? Him making that argument proved the point that there is systematic profiling. Right now, federal law does not close the loopholes on religious profiling by federal officials. The loopholes are too big for religious profiling. I think it's disproportionate targeting that's happening, unfortunately, that's leading to a lot of American Muslims, growing up throughout. I remember, and I'll finish sort of with these points, crossing the border as a child, or not as a teenager, taking my grandma to visit her sister. And within a minute, I was in handcuffs. There was no resistance, there was no argument, standard procedure. And my message to people within the administration at the time was, how do you think it feels to grow up as an American Muslim, where every time you're crossing the border, or half the time you're crossing the border, you're held for hours, and you're in handcuffs, you're treated like a criminal. It could make you hate this country. It could reinforce the message of our extremists. Now, thank God it pushed me to build one of the largest civil rights organizations in the state of Florida to counter this, CAIR Florida. And I'm proud of it. So thank you, Customs, for inspiring me to do that. But the problem isn't going away. We need to challenge it. And just recently, as a final point, we documented that throughout the United States in the month leading up to the Trump administration, because when my brother was pulled over, I sort of did a little Facebook Live video. It got a lot of views, and a lot of people started contacting us about their stories at the border. And we documented how U.S. Customs was singling out Americans, including Muhammad Ali's own son and ex-wife, who we're helping right now and assisting, and asking them the following questions. Are you a devout Muslim? How many times a day do you pray? What mosque do you go to? What school of thought do you follow? What do you think of Donald Trump? What do you think of killing Americans? What do you think of killing civilians? All based on their religion, being asked about their religion. This isn't about targeting Muslims. It's about targeting Americans in violation of the First Amendment, and we really need to close the loopholes that make this possible. Thank you, and God bless you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Can you hear me? Hello, hello, wonderful. Now we'll hear from Professor Patrisia Macias-Rojas from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Professor Macias-Rojas conducted an in-depth ethnography of life in border communities. And I highly recommend her book, which I hope she will mention during the presentation. I believe it's the Prison to Deportation Pipeline, and Chapter 5 in particular is exactly on point for our purposes today. With that, I'll turn it over to Professor Macias-Rojas.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So, yes, so I began researching immigration enforcement in U.S.-Mexico border communities over a decade ago. I actually began the fieldwork just before 9/11 and conducted a bulk of it in its aftermath at a time when the former Immigration Service was reorganized under what we now know today as the Department of Homeland Security. So then as now, those were dark days, and it wasn't entirely clear yet how the federal government's war on terror would unfold and what the consequences would be for immigrant communities. So when I began the ethnography, actually on my very first day of doing fieldwork at a migrant shelter in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, I was in an auto accident. I was actually coming back from the shelter, and I took a taxi to the port of entry in Nogales, and it was late. I was rushing back, which aroused suspicion from the immigration agent, who questioned the whereabouts and authenticity of my passport. So this is routine practice at the border. So once he eventually waved me through, I caught a shuttle up to Tucson. So everything happened quickly. 20 miles from the border, a tire blew out, the driver lost control, the van swerved across the lanes and drove off the highway, flipped over, and landed in the desert brush. In my field notes that night, I wrote, "Adrenaline racing. I can't believe we survived. I could hear the moans of people in the back. The driver stepped on my face trying to break the windshield to get out. Someone pulled me out quickly, afraid that the van would catch fire. We all got out safely. Border Patrol showed up even before the paramedics. I watched them shine flashlights on people, no doubt trying to identify if we were undocumented. They made everyone squat on the ground the way they do when they apprehend people. I refused to squat, ignored their orders. A paramedic asked for my social security number. I declined to give it." So the handling of that accident blurred the lines between a migrant apprehension and a criminal arrest and captures the complexity of border security, U.S.-Mexico border security, that I want to talk about today. So in this case, the agents weren't just checking our immigration status, they were sorting us according to criminal status too. And once they confirmed our criminal and legal status, that the driver wasn't smuggling us into the country, then they turned the case over to the paramedics. Only then did the handling of the accident shift from a crime scene to a medical intervention. So what I witnessed on the ground back then wasn't matching up with the rhetoric of fighting terrorism and intercepting weapons of mass destruction. What I saw in practice then was little more than crime control extended to an immigration context. So in the remainder of my time, I'd like to turn our attention to the crime politics of the 80s and 90s that created new enforcement targets that have fundamentally transformed immigration enforcement and border policing, and then I'll turn to how these enforcement priorities play out in border communities. So during the Reagan era, as you know, right, Black and Latino youths were disproportionately pushed into prisons, right? And legislators at the time knew that the system didn't have the capacity. They didn't have the cells or the beds to warehouse that many people. So rather than to rethink these policies that were packing too many people in already overcrowded prisons, they turned the problem into an issue of bed space, not enough prison beds. So you see in the historical record that I've looked at, legislators scrambling to come up with ways to deal with overcrowding and expand the capacity of prisons. You see Congress then investing in prison expansion and turning to the private sector to manage and build more prisons. So it's in this scramble for beds that the idea came out to go after non-citizens swept up in the drug war. So in 1989, it was estimated that there were approximately 10,000 non-citizens in prisons for low-level drug offenses. And so legislators said, you know, if we could deport these people, we could make more beds available. And so it's at that time that non-citizens with convictions became an enforcement priority in the immigration system. But targeting immigrants with convictions would not be easy, since an estimated 55% were legal immigrants with protections in the system. So to implement this, Congress had to statutorily transform deportation and detention, which it did under the 1996 Immigration Act, right? In other words, these new enforcement priorities required a rolling out of several legal mechanisms to make it happen. The use of information technology to track people with criminal history, the implementation of fast-track methods of deportation, expansion of detention beds, cooperation between immigration and local law enforcement. I mean, these are many of the policies that we associate with the criminalization of migration today. So now these new enforcement priorities and this transformation of immigration and border policing has had a profound impact, I think, on border communities in southern Arizona. So these are just some images from a dear friend that will just be in the background. But so these are predominantly Latino low-income communities. Most of the residents in the communities are not, in fact, immigrants. In Nogales, for instance, 95% are Latino. There's a per capita income of $14,000, and roughly 60% are citizens. In Douglas, it's 82% Latino with a per capita income of $13,000. 70% are U.S. citizens. So in these communities, then, where I was conducting the field work, every day, 24 hours a day, Border Patrol vehicles drive up and down the streets, and it's uncommon to walk for more than 5 minutes without encountering an agent. So when I started the field work, there were 2,200. Today, that number has more than doubled to 42 for the entire sector. So every single person I spoke with in these communities, because at the time I was conducting a survey in 5 border communities right on the border. I'm not talking about Phoenix. I'm not talking about Tucson. I'm talking about the communities right on the line. All of them had been pulled over at some point, multiple times on criminal grounds. So it wasn't so much that agents thought they were undocumented, they were targeting them as criminal suspects, as potential smugglers. And so they interrogated, confiscated the property of, prosecuted, incarcerated, and even deported local residents for immigration violations, like smuggling, with regular occurrence. And so border residents often didn't have the economic or political resources to challenge the charges brought against them. So I'm going to quickly just share some excerpts before wrapping up. And in this one excerpt, I'm visiting the home of a local school teacher, and she doesn't really want to talk to me, but she warms up eventually, and she says, you know, it's gotten to a point where you can't help someone because they think you're a smuggler. The woman next door had, pigs in the back, and she built a pen. Well, the smugglers would hide people out there, and she got punished for it. She we had to get dogs out and back because we don't want anyone back there. They'll take you to jail. They'll take your house, your car, your papers. The other day, a woman came to my door and asked if I could give her some water. She had a baby bottle, so I filled it, and she drank it, and she asked for more. She asked me to fill it like 4 times. I felt bad for her and asked her where the baby was. She said she left the baby hiding. I filled up a gallon for her, and Border Patrol passed by and picked her up. He started yelling at me and told me I couldn't do that. And I said to him, if someone comes to my house and asks me for water, I will give it. I don't work for the Border Patrol. That's your job. So in more extreme cases, women had told me they confessed to being cavity searched for drugs. Other residents had been beaten. Others spoke of Border Patrol shootings. Since 2010, there have been at least 6 fatal Border Patrol shootings in southern Arizona alone, and 3 non-fatal shootings. So one woman shared an account of one that happened just after the buildup in the 1990s. And she said, it's like a war zone here. There were 40 to 60 people running through, helicopters flying all night, shining lights through here. A 13-year-old girl got shot by a Border Patrol. She set up a tent out in back and was playing camp, and at about 3 o'clock, she heard dogs and got scared. She was running back home with her backpack when a Border Patrol shot her in the knee from behind. The Border Patrol said she was carrying drugs in her backpack. Her family complained, but they didn't get anything. So the family filed that formal complaint and followed the grievance procedures, yet they were never compensated because the agents classified the 13-year-old girl as a smuggler. So my point here is to call attention to the overreach of enforcement priorities. Border residents, many of whom are not immigrants, are classified as criminal through search and seizure practices, through criminal prosecution and incarceration, and even deportation. So there actually are cases of citizen residents who have been deported. So enacted on the ground, these new enforcement mandates extend the collateral consequences of a conviction to an immigration and border context. The stigma of being labeled a criminal justifies a negation of personhood regardless of citizenship. So the diffusion of DHS enforcement priorities institutionalize a linkage between membership and criminal history that I believe is actually rooted in anti-Blackness, whereby the citizen becomes the antithesis to the criminal. So to wrap up, what I've really tried to do here is to draw on my historical and ethnographic research to shed light on some of these transformations in contemporary border security. Other historians here have spoken of these earlier periods, which are fundamentally important. And I've tried to show with my work how the period of the 80s and 90s at the height of mass incarceration matters and is crucial for really understanding the Department of Homeland Security's current enforcement priorities. I really think we have to pay attention to them because they're not going away. If anything, they're being exported globally to justify indefinite detention, torture, and drone strikes. These enforcement targets, as you know, they can't exist without the technological infrastructure that makes them workable. The implementation of these priorities depends on technology and surveillance. The INS wasn't able to do any of this until it developed these biometric technologies. So I do believe it's important for us to pay more attention and move beyond the political rhetoric of good and bad immigrants and really trace the history of these criminal enforcement priorities to see what they're really about. When you look into their history, they were never really about crime or immigration, but rather a political rhetoric that candidates from Goldwater to the current administration have used to win elections.
Now we will turn to Patrick Eddington of the Cato Institute under a regulation issued in, I believe it was the 1950s, and there's an excellent ACLU memorandum written by a friend, Chris Rickard, online that will explain its origins. The Border Patrol is authorized to conduct border searches not within 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, 4 miles, but within 100 miles of the border. And so Patrick Eddington will discuss what that means, what these look like, what the law is, what the law should be, and everything in between. Patrick.
Alvaro, thank you so very much. And my thanks to your colleagues as well here, my fellow Hoyas at CPT, for inviting me to be a part of this today. Everybody can hear me okay? Am I good? All right. I've been in Washington almost 30 years, and I will tell you that I thought I had heard of everything until in the fall of 2014, I left the House of Representatives as a staffer and went to work at the Cato Institute and took over the DHS portfolio, essentially, and began to kind of dig in on some of these issues. And when I worked on the Hill, I dealt with TSA-related stuff, the porno scanners. We did manage to get those out of the airport, one of the very few post-9/11 victories for privacy and civil liberties. The downside was they put them in the Bureau of Prisons. You can kind of guess what that means. But I was amazed, horrified, stunned to learn that these things called internal checkpoints existed in the United States of America. So that's put me on the path of exploring this topic, and I want to share a few things with you today. This kind of gives you a ground level view of part of the Laredo checkpoint. Alvaro just mentioned this entire thing. How did this all come about? How did we get to a place where a group of bureaucrats in the Department of Justice in 1953 get the bright idea that we should have this, that we should have an internal zone in the United States that can stretch as far as 100 miles. And just to make sure everybody gets the point here, we're talking about encompassing essentially the biggest cities in the United States. We right now are in the border zone according to Customs and Border Protection, sitting in McDonough Hall here at Georgetown Law. It encompasses Miami, New York City, Boston, LA, Chicago. 2/3 of the U.S. population, by the estimate of our friends at the American Civil Liberties Union. So this gets created in the 1950s, and we roll along, and when we finally get a challenge to this in the 1970s. This is kind of a snapshot from a GAO report that was issued in 2009. Those dots represent fixed checkpoints. That map's not accurate. I'm engaged in a project at Cato right now to actually map these things throughout the United States. I can tell you it's more like 40 of these things that stretch essentially from Southern California all the way through Texas. I'll get into that project in more in just a minute. But what I wanted to be able to give you a sense of here is the fact that in 1976, a Supreme Court decision called U.S. versus Martinez-Fuerte was handed down. It involved 3 separate incidents with respect to the transportation of undocumented persons into the United States, and it examined the question of whether the use of such checkpoints for warrantless seizures and visual inspections, read searches, violated the Fourth Amendment. And Justice Powell, writing for the majority at the time, asserted that given the huge problem of undocumented immigration and CBP's responsibility to prevent it, under the, quote, circumstances of these checkpoint stops which do not involve searches, think about that for a second, the government or public interest in making such stops outweigh the constitutionally protected interest of the private citizen. In summary, we hold that stops for brief routine questioning, not further defined, conducted at permanent checkpoints are consistent with the Fourth Amendment and need not be authorized by warrant. Now, if that leaves your head scratching, Justices Brennan and Marshall had exactly the same reaction. And in their dissent, they noted, quote, the court assumes, and I certainly agree, that persons stopped at fixed checkpoints, whether or not referred to as secondary detention area, are seized within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment. Moreover, since the vehicle and its occupants are subjected to visual inspection, the intrusion clearly exceeds mere physical restraint, for officers are able to see more in a stopped vehicle than in vehicles traveling at normal speeds down the highway. They went on to say, quote, finally, the court's argument fails for more basic reasons. There is no principle in the jurisprudence of fundamental rights which permits constitutional limitations to be dispensed with merely because they cannot be conveniently satisfied. Dispensing with reasonable suspicion as a prerequisite to stopping and inspecting motorists because the inconvenience of such a requirement would make it impossible to identify a given car as a possible carrier of aliens is no more justifiable than dispensing with probable cause as a prerequisite to the search of an individual because the inconvenience of such a requirement would make it impossible to identify a given person in a high crime area as a possible carrier of concealed weapons. From my perspective, the effect of the Martinez-Fuerte decision was that CBP agents were allowed to use the court's ruling to conduct immigration inspections, quote unquote, on any vehicle seeking to pass through the checkpoint. And CBP officers were instructed to inquire as to the citizenship of the drivers and passengers. What the decision did not require, and this is where the conflict comes in at these checkpoints over and over and over again, is that motorists actually answer the questions posed by CBP agents. Now, what are the consequences of, let's say, going through the Laredo checkpoint and not playing ball with CBP? Well, Greg Rosenberg found out in September 2014. He's a long-haul trucker and a naturalized American citizen from Armenia. He grew up in the Soviet system. He knows what these things look like. He knows what these things really mean. So Greg was stopped at this checkpoint on a late night in September of 2014. He was asked about his immigration status, and he asserted his constitutional rights. So from the agent's perspective, he's not white, he has an accent, he's asserting his rights. You can probably guess what happens next, but I'll give it to you kind of blow by blow. They dragged him out of his vehicle, they roughed him up, and they proceeded to hold him incommunicado for 19 days. 19 days. They actually filed a lawsuit against him in federal court. They wound up having to drop that because he was threatening to do exactly the same to them. I wish I could tell you that Rosenberg's case is unique, but as you heard from the speaker who preceded me, it simply isn't the case. Part of our problem is that we don't have a good sense of the magnitude of just exactly how much of this happens. We got a slight glimpse of just exactly how crazy these checkpoints really are in terms of their inefficiency when the Government Accountability Office did what amounts to the only large-scale survey so far back in 2009. And what they found is that these checkpoints utilize 4% of CBP's personnel but only account for 2% of actual detentions of folks trying to enter this country illegally. So right there you've got a manpower mismatch, a resource mismatch, in addition to rights violations that are taking place. And the Arizona chapter of the ACLU has been engaged in a lot of litigation on this, FOIA and otherwise. And what they found in a report that they subsequently published called Record of Abuse, which you can find online, in the Tucson sector in 2013, apprehensions of undocumented persons accounted for 0.6% of the sector's total apprehensions. In calendar year 2013, 9 out of 23 Tucson sector checkpoints produced 0 arrests for deportable subjects. The same year in the Yuma sector, checkpoints arrests of U.S. citizens actually exceeded those of non-U.S. citizens by a factor of nearly 8, and in 2011 by a factor of 11. One checkpoint in the Yuma sector located 75 miles from the border reported only 1 non-citizen apprehension in 3 years, while producing multiple civil rights complaints during the same period. Now, as you can probably guess, our friends at the ACLU in Arizona are representing a number of litigants in lawsuits against CBP over exactly these kinds of detentions, and of course those continue to grind through the courts. I will tell you that I have had a FOIA in front of CBP on administrative appeal for 18 months now that seeks to get data nationally on this stuff. It's no real shock that they're stonewalling me, because I think if the numbers actually were to be put out there, it would absolutely blow people's minds. It's gotten so bad that in Arivaca, Arizona, where you've got at least 2 checkpoints that I know of, have become such an absolute problem for the people who live and work in that community that they have had confrontations with CBP agents on an almost daily basis, and they have set up their own citizen monitoring units to try to record the rights violations and other activities that are taking place at those checkpoints. The bottom line here is that these checkpoints are, existing court decisions notwithstanding, clearly in contravention of the intent of the founders with respect to the Fourth Amendment, and constitutional rights violations occur daily at these checkpoints. They're demonstrably ineffective, and thus a massive waste of taxpayer money. And for all of those reasons, they should be shut down. If I had a mic, I'd do a drop, because I think I'm under my time.
You've heard plenty from me, so I want to open it up to 2 questions from the audience. The first hand I saw go up was you, sir. Ali, if you could give it to the gentleman in the lighter shirt furthest back. Thank you. And then we will turn to you. Wonderful. Excellent.
Hi, my name is Jeff Landale. I'm with the XLab program at Penn State University. I've noticed a common theme that was encapsulated by Pat Eddington's talk at the end, that these programs are demonstrably ineffective, a waste of taxpayer dollars, based on junk science. But I've also noticed another thread, which is that they all seem to have similar impacts. They are about the atomization of community, fraying of social bonds, where imams stop being spiritual leaders but become purveyors of surveillance and suspicion. Teachers stop trying to cultivate good habits and intelligence in children, but are instead building a sense of civic virtue on the idea of identifying potential terrorists or criminals. I'm wondering if our response to these programs changes if we stop taking their goal at their word, which they are demonstrably failing to achieve, and instead start assuming that their goal is the consistent, strong, and forceful impact that they are having. Does that change how we respond to these programs and how we put an end to them?
And we're going to go to the second question so then the panel can answer both in tandem, please.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, nice.
Hello.
So my name is Luis. I'm a recent graduate from Grinnell College. I have no law degree, so my
You're still
question is
welcome
going to
here.
be, yeah, thank you.
Yes.
From what I heard, my question stems from the standards of the people that get hired for those positions for agents. Like, who has the power to change those standards? Because I feel like, I don't know, like a week ago I talked to a cop and I asked him, how can you become a cop? And he just told me, you just need a high school education and pass a test, and the test is not even as hard as the SAT. So I wonder if this has an effect on the way they conduct themselves, right? You know, how much education they have. I feel like we should raise the standards for all the agents to at least have an associate's degree and have requirements like take sociology classes and, I don't know, just, you know, increase the standards. Who has the power to do that? Because I feel like if you're just coming out of high school, and I don't know if you guys remember your high school, it was very segregated, and you know, you stuck to your own people, and you know, you know, you didn't have that chance to challenge your innate prejudices and, you know, how you see the world. So I wonder, you know.
Excellent question. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I want to make sure you get an answer. So if folks on the panel want to, I think each of you is qualified to answer both of these questions. So do you want to start, Patrick?
So let me jump in and answer your question first with respect to standards. When left to its own devices, right, any agency or department will ultimately set its own standards unless Congress has done something from a statutory standpoint to do it. And your concern is exquisitely well grounded, because this administration has talked about actually lowering the hiring standards for CBP. And we know that in some of these shooting cases that were referred to by my colleague up here, that some of the folks that were involved in that had previously been kicked off of other police forces for exactly the same kind of brutality. So one of the things that's happened to CBP over the last 15 years is that they've really lost any kind of genuine internal affairs functioning mechanism. There was an op-ed that was published, I think, just within the last 2 years about one of the individuals who worked in that shop, and he was bemoaning the fact that the changes there were really going to lead to problems, and he proved to be prophetic. So I think one of the first things that has to happen is you've got to have a reconstitution of, you know, that kind of internal affairs capability to CBP. But then you also have to have a Justice Department that's willing to go after agents that engage in violence, unwarranted use of force. And we just have not seen a proclivity on the part of folks to do that. And to get to Jeff's question, I'm going to give you all a message here, and I really hope you take it to heart. I spent 10 years as a lobbyist and 10 years on Capitol Hill. I'm going to tell you that none of these problems are going to get solved in any kind of substantive way unless you get involved in direct political action. And I'm talking about electoral action. That is what it's going to take. You want to get politicians interested in this, you need to make politicians afraid of you and not responding to your concerns. That's the key to all of this. I don't care if it's dealing with FISA surveillance, Rule 41, go down the list, this as well. You've got to be politically involved, and you've got to make your voices heard at the end of the day. Now, you know, I'm at Cato. We don't take pro-con positions on legislation, things of that nature. But what I can say to you, based on my experience from the Hill, is that politicians can be moved most effectively when they know that there are voters who are going to come after them if they do not do the right thing. And that's where you've got to start this entire process at the end of the day. Petitions are wonderful. They can help raise consciousness. But you have got to show politicians that if they allow these things to continue, there are going to be electoral consequences for them. End of soapbox.
You're welcome. This is the soapbox, so it's okay. Hassan.
Yeah, very quickly, at best case, U.S. Customs agents are a reflection of the general population. I say at best case because they're probably not. But the general population study has shown that 50% of Americans support the notion that American Muslims should have to wear special ID cards. Now, what was the last group that had to wear special ID cards? Was the Jews in Germany prior to the Holocaust. You have significant populations, depending on what demographic you're studying, that believe Islam should be illegal, sometimes over 60. About 70% of Trump voters supported the idea of banning Islam in America. Now, again, that's an assault on the Constitution, not on just not just on the Muslim community. So unfortunately, a lot of the agents have this prejudice. And Gil Kurowski, the last CBP commissioner, admitted it. I mean, there needs to be much education regarding these issues because it is impacting how they interact. And they have a lot of power. I mean, recently, I forgot to mention this earlier, they're demanding social media passwords of American citizens. Imagine being forced to turn over your social media password. And the reason you're being forced to turn that over is because of your religion. So that's how problematic it is. And to address the other question very quickly, there's a clear discriminatory agenda. Frontline recently did a documentary. I highly encourage you to watch the episode on Bannon's War. He believes America should be at war with Islam, and now he's in the Oval Office, and then he pushed out the Muslim ban to further that. The Muslim ban did not happen, and this kind of targeting of Americans based on religion didn't happen in a vacuum. It's the result of the Islamophobia industry. You can go to Islamophobia.org and read about it, and read about the funding and how it impacts politics. But over $200 million being spent to demonize Americans based on their religion, demonize Islam, and really push for outlawing Islam. In Tennessee, they tried to pass a law saying practicing Islam is treason, punishable by 20 years in jail. And legislators were actually considering that kind of legislation. So it's no wonder that the CBP agent on the ground is picking on Americans based on their religion. And the real direct solution, by the way, besides the political work, is we have to educate the community. I mean, I'm telling the American Muslim community and everybody flat out, don't answer personal religious questions. The answer is, and I did this to an officer, he asked me a question and my answer was, none of your damn business. Okay, but they need to be put in place when they cross the constitutional boundaries, and we can't empower them to abuse it by giving in and answering their questions and turning over our social media passwords and so on.
We turn to close us out.
Can I add?
Professor,
Professor
Macias-Rojas.
Well, I don't know if you want to close out with this, but one thing I wanted to point out is that I think we should really pay attention. When we're thinking about training our agents, we should pay more attention to the Border Patrol Union and the ICE Union and the kind of power that they have to shape messages and policies. I've been looking at, in looking at overcrowding in the 80s and 90s, it's interesting how these policies of overcrowding, the intense overcrowding was impacting correctional officers. They were having to subdue people who were protesting unfair conditions. And so both inmates and correctional officers were affected by these policies, right? But correctional officers were able to shape the message that somehow we needed supermax prisons, we needed, more policing, we needed higher wages for them, and lobbying and gaining more power to shape these messages instead of pushing back and saying, you know what, these mandatory minimums are messed up for all of us, inmates and correctional officers who frankly come from many low-income communities, right? And that's certainly the case with the Border Patrol. When I first started doing the research, I could tell the difference between agents who had grown up in border communities and agents who were kind of thrown in there and hired very quickly. And in my last visit, I noticed that the language was changing, that they didn't have that nuance in their language where they were talking about migrants as workers, as families, as people. In some cases, of course, there are some that haven't, but they were talking about them through a language of crime. They were saying, no, we're not calling them UDAs or undocumented aliens. They're illegal. That's a really different way of thinking and framing. So anyway, but the point I want to get out there is we should pay more attention to the Border Patrol Union and to the ICE Union and learn from what happened in the criminal justice system and the power that the Correctional Officers Union had.
Thank you so much. If you'll join me in thanking our panel. Thank you. Great.